dear ladies and gentlemen and colleagues. Micro is working? Very good. We are moving now into the afternoon session of the second day, and I'm very proud and happy to have a wonderful and distinguished panel on my left-hand side. During the next 1 hour and a half, our main focus is on actually ourselves. We would like to look at the science systems, the knowledge systems, the knowledge networks, and how they contribute to development. During the last 1.5 days, we very much focused on issue areas, digitalization, financial markets, education, and which kind of solutions we have ready for them. Now we would like to focus on the question, looking at the kind of issues which we have been debating, development challenges, sustainability challenges, the climate crisis, artificial intelligence escalating. Are our systems which we are working with ready to this? Are we good and well prepared for that? This is what we would like to focus on during the next 1.5 hours. To give you some flavor of what might be of interest, I mean, after all these decades of investing in the field of development research and sustainable development research, when we look to Africa, Timothy, we discussed this briefly in the morning, still the overall R&D ratios at your continent are very, very low. So we do not make macro-oriented progresses there. Although we have been developing many networks around Africa, on African development, but this is an issue. Then on the other hand side, in other countries, let's talk for a second about the OECD world, we do have high investments in research and development, in science systems, but at the same time we are moving into fundamental political and economical troubles. So right-wing populism is threatening sustainable development, although we have fantastic science systems there. So what is moving wrong? How can we use science better to link it with societal development? How can we understand the nexus between science and societal development? When it comes to our kind of issues which we are debating here, there are some elements which are popping up again and again, which I listened to during the last 1.5 days. One of these issues is speed. So we are under time pressure to deliver 2030 agenda, only 10 years to come. If we talk to climate scientists, they are arguing that during the next decades to come, we have to halve global emissions every decade. So again, speed. Science is about reflection. Science needs time, but we need to deliver rapidly. How can we improve in this regard? We talked a lot during the last 1.5 days about our silos, and how we can improve interdisciplinary research and then also interdisciplinary focus to work together with societal stakeholders. What is transdisciplinary actually about? Have we been making progress in this regard? These are also fields which are of major importance. Then in the morning, we reflected how artificial intelligence and machine learning might change fundamentally the way we think about science and the way we do science. So are we taking this on board? Are we prepared for that? These are some of the questions which we already focused on during the last 1.5 days, and I'm looking for Pierre, the president of the Global Development Network. Pierre, when I understood you right yesterday morning, what you said is that when we think about solutions, very often we think about policy dimensions, not reflecting about the politics of it. So is this something which we need to reflect upon? I would like to remember all of you that we have a colleague who has been working here at the University of Berlin and then for many years was a director of the Institute for Development Studies in Brighton, Hans Singer. He needed to leave Germany during fascism. And in one of his papers, he wrote that development economics and development research is too much focused on policy dimensions and too little reflecting on what you emphasize, Pierre, the politics dimension. So these are some of the issues we might be discussing during the next 90 minutes. I would like to start with my colleague here on the left-hand side, Omar. And Omar, you are coming from Panama, and you are heading a system which creates knowledge for development in your country. That's right. And I would like to ask you to start 5 to 6 minutes, and then we move from colleague to colleague to have a broader discussion afterwards with the auditorium. Okay. So please, Omar.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here and have a voice at this very enriching discussion. First, I would like to give you a little glimpse of Panama very briefly. You know, Panama is a small country, about 4 million people. It has some excellent macro indicators of the economy, but at the same time is one of the most unequal countries. So that's a challenge for us, and the institution that I represent, which is the National Science and Research Institution from the government, it's our mission to bring science and research as part of that development, as a tool for developing of the country. So in order to, 20 years ago, in order to increase those R&D indicators, macro indicators, we started a strategy. We started investing in human capital to bring up, the number of very well-trained students to be prepared abroad, so that they can return to the country, and then they be incorporating in this strategy to produce, added value to the many sectors or the productive sectors of the country. So, in summary, we have invested a significant amount of money in training people abroad in the best universities across the world, producing probably over 350 PhD students, plus twice as much of master's degrees abroad. About 15 years ago, 5 years after that we started with a program, parallel programs on investing in repatriation of those professionals that were abroad, bringing it back to Panama. We initiated a process of open calls for funding to do research. Little starts up for those researchers to start, creating knowledge, local knowledge. And that has been basically our strategy. But, where are we now? So we have grown, and we have, I will say, a vibrant community of researchers. And during these 20 years also, we have created some infrastructure, at least one very well-established institute. We have strengthened other institute in doing research. We have incorporated strategies for evaluating progress for research, so that the research is not only an output, but also has quality. And yesterday we were discussing here about the quality of the research, right? And so integrity of the research is important to be valid for making decisions. So that's what have happened on the last 20 years, but there's been some limitations to that effort, right? One of them is that of all those 350 plus PhD students and twice the master's degrees, once they return to the country, not necessarily get involved in research activities. So there is a dilution effect of this strategy. And on top of that, we do have a percentage of people that decide to stay abroad, or others come back to Panama and then decide to return to their country where they were conducting their research, or they did the degree. So this is about 5%. It's not that much, but it's still, out of 300, it's significant. And that's not the intention of the strategy, of course. So what is the root of this diluting effect and this sort of, brain drain? It's basically infrastructure. So we have come short to invest in the necessary infrastructure to provide, the conditions for people to do research and to do high quality research. And at the same time, the universities have not been adaptive enough to create also that space. But another limitation of this has been the disproportionate recruiting strategy. So most of those 350 PhD students, and this is in terms of achieving or attaining the sustainable goals. One of these limitations is that we mostly train people in the strengths that the country naturally has by history, which is natural history, biology, biodiversity, and the other one is tropical diseases. So that has been a little problem. So the other problem that we identify is that there is an issue of alignment of the stakeholders. So the stakeholders, not everybody is on the same page with the CENACYT, with the institution that promotes the science. And so we need progressive thinking platforms, and we need these new platforms for paradigm changing research. So that's another issue. But at the same time, and the last concluding remark is that also most of the research that has been devoted in the country has responded to a structure of disciplinary research oriented in specific areas, and now it's a challenge to tell those trained disciplinary to think in a multidimensional platform, right? Because all the challenges that we face are multidimensional. So having to tell the scientists from these unidisciplinary fields to merge into attack problems in a different perspective is quite of a challenge. And for the future, we just are thinking about introducing disruptive financing to make possible that they merge with other fields. But we still need development researchers and economists and social scientists to join in the effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Omar, for your presentation. I would like to move directly towards Simone Sandholz. Simone is a senior scientist at the United Nations University. And please, Simone, please come up with your reflections and ideas of what we are discussing here.
Thanks. And I would like to start by picking up what Omar said. I like very much your remark on the platform for paradigm-changing research. I'm located just next door. I don't know if we are already fulfilling that full vision of a platform, but there in United Nations University, we're a group of researchers working towards the SDGs, obviously, sustainable development, and very much related to natural hazards research. And the idea of transdisciplinarity, I believe, is something we are picking very much up on, just that you get to know it. So when I reflect on where I'm working, I usually reflect on the topics we're working on, or not on the disciplines, which is, I believe, something which is distinguishing us from a, let's say, normal university, where you start thinking in your disciplines, and then at a certain point you may start thinking beyond. But if we think about sustainability, that's an overarching and cross-cutting issue. So hopefully that can be picked up and developed further by something like working towards visions and working towards solving problems instead of sticking to certain silos, which is something you remarked earlier. So that work across disciplines, but also across cultures and continents even, I believe, is something which is very crucial. And again, that's something I noticed. You mentioned how many students you send abroad. I don't know if we ever had a Panamese student, but we have like 25 students each year in our master's program on global risk and human security. And they're from all over the world. And I believe we're challenging them a lot just by bringing them together with all their different perspectives, national backgrounds, but also professional backgrounds. And it may not be easy in the beginning, but once they complete their masters, they gained more than just the disciplinary knowledge, but they know how to work together and how to collaborate. And that's an added value when they hopefully then return back to their countries to work towards sustainability. So that is very different from my own background when I did my master's or bachelor's in a certain discipline where I never was trained to work across and just to work with a neighboring engineering discipline or so. So it's important to work within academia, but when thinking about transdisciplinarity, it is also very crucial to work with people from practice. And that's, again, a very important point. which maybe we're not trained enough on in doing pure research. And there we have to shift some paradigms towards acknowledging that as a very important part, that outreach, so that also the outside world gets to know more about what we're doing. And that can only be done by thinking about the outputs. So usually in my discipline, there's a certain number of journals I have to publish in to be recognized within my discipline as a high-class, world-leading researcher. But that's not transdisciplinary per se, because that may involve other outreach media, which then contradict somehow the disciplinary boundaries. So we have to think about how to move beyond our own communities, but still get rewarded for it within our disciplines. And then again, we have to think about the practitioners we're working with. So if I'm saying I have published X number of scientific papers, that may not reach the people I have worked with in all those research projects, so they may even get frustrated in working with researchers because they just take but don't give back. So just as we just concluded a major research project, and then we asked all the practitioners we work with, yeah, how do you want to have those research results, in what format we can do X publications or that number of reports, and they just said, I need a one-pager with tick boxes that I can work on. And that's completely different to what we are used to. So that's, again, something we have to keep in mind when doing disciplinary research and breaking the silos of our disciplines, but also from research to practice. And I found it always very rewarding, but it has to be rewarding in the system itself.
Okay, thank you very much, Simone. We go to Howard White. You are now CEO of Campbell Collaboration. Many of us know you as the founding director of the International Initiative of Impact Evaluation. So you have been very interested about a very long period of time in pushing all of us towards looking at the impacts of what we do. A bit what Simone just mentioned, actually. Not only delivering papers and outputs, but looking at the impact of something. So, Howard, your perspective after having changed from the impact evaluation world to your new institution.
Right, so we have seen over the last 15 years or so what I call the evidence revolution, and a key component of that has been the growth of studies of the effectiveness of programs and policies, and the award of the Nobel Prize to the people behind JPAL last week recognises the importance of this evidence revolution in doing much more policy-relevant research in the development setting. Despite that, we have what I call a scandalous underinvestment in the global evidence architecture. This evidence architecture exists precisely to tackle the issue of getting research into use. And this evidence architecture exists in practical terms, mainly in health, and virtually not in any other sector, and I will illustrate that. So I have a concept I call the knowledge translation pyramid, and I'll go through the levels of this pyramid. I've mentioned various blogs and papers, you can look it up. And at the base of this pyramid are data. But we hear now, Dirk mentioned at the beginning, oh, there's lots of data available and so on, but data are not evidence. And many people say, oh, we have the data, now we'll see what works. You can't do that from data alone. Data need to be analysed in order to become evidence. And the evidence you get from single studies tells you about a particular programme you're working on, but of course cannot necessarily be transferred or generalised elsewhere, and I'll come back to that in a second. So just looking at the global disparity, a recent review of randomised controlled trials in education across the globe, not in developing countries, across the globe, they're mainly in the UK and US, found 1,017 RCTs in education globally. In the 3i database, which looks at impact evaluations of development interventions, the number has grown very rapidly. There used to be around 50 a year back in 2003, 2004. Now there are over 500 a year published, but still the total number is still just 5,000 RCT impact evaluations of development interventions. If you look at the Cochrane Clinical Trials database of RCTs in health, and it's still work in progress, there are 1.5 million trials. 1.5 million. Compared to 1,000 education, 5,000 development programs. Massive disparity, massive underinvestment in the evidence architecture outside of health. Now, we've got all of these studies, a growing number of studies, 5,000 development. What are you going to do to them? To summarize those, you have to do systematic reviews, and that's what Campbell, my organization where I now work, does. So traditional literature reviews are biased. There are many sources of bias. If someone tells me, I'm going to commission this expert to do a literature review for me, I say, save your money, just ask her what she thinks, because that's what the literature review will say. Okay? They'll just reinforce their own priors and biases in their literature review. Systematic reviews don't do that. But again, we have this disjuncture. There are around 1,000 education reviews. There are around 600 international development reviews. Epistemonicus, for Database for Health, has 38,000 systematic reviews on health. Massive disparities in the investment in the evidence architecture. We, first at 3IE, but now at Campbell, we do evidence maps. We actually map the evidence. You can put the evidence in database, which is nice, like Epistemonicus 3i database, but we can make maps of the evidence so we get an overview what the evidence architecture looks like. And we're doing this in more and more areas. Anyone out there from a funder or a research council, if you're not doing evidence maps as base for your funding, then you really should be, because that's where you can see where there is evidence and where there's not evidence. And the most crucial use of these maps is to say, where is there high quality evidence from systematic reviews that we can build knowledge translation products? Knowledge translation products are evidence portals, like the What Works centres in the UK and the Clearinghouse in the US, where they have knowledge products that a user can go to and see what works in their sector. Or we have guidelines, or we have checklists, what you just mentioned. Here's a checklist. I'm doing a community-based development programme. What are the key things I ought to do? Like have a community worker that speaks the same language as people in the community. Just basic checklists of things you need to do, supported by the evidence. In the health sector, World Health Organization produces international guidelines that countries around the world then adopt in the national guidelines. WHO has guidelines on producing guidelines, and those guidelines say WHO guidelines must be based on high-quality systematic reviews. So institutionalizing use evidence from high-quality systematic reviews of high-quality effectiveness studies. No other sector does that. Other organizations like FAO and so on may put out guidelines, but they're not evidence-based. And the key thing about the evidence portals, the guidelines, and the checklists is they allow the decision maker to make decisions without going back and reading the research reports. And that's what you need. Databases, maps, take you back to the research report. We have a review on deworming, it's a very good review, but it's 700 pages long. So no policymaker or even advisor is ever going to read that. But we have a plain language summary like we do. But more importantly to us, the WHO guidelines revised last year were revised on the basis of the Campbell and Cochrane reviews. And we've been working with the Indian government to get them to revise their deworming policy. They said, we'll see what WHO says. They changed their policy. Indian government changed their guidelines. So we've got to build this evidence architecture. Evidence is a global public good. Okay? And what we don't see any longer, it was different 10 years ago, I set up 3IE, we had donors out there willing to invest in the public good of evidence. That is no longer true. So organizations like, sorry if you're here, but Gates or David, are now much more interested in funding things that benefit them, they want to know, and condition their so-called investment evidence much more strongly on their own interests, and are not willing to actually just invest in the global public good that's evidence. And it's what I call the scandalous underinvestment in the global evidence architecture. That's where I came in, so that's where I'll finish.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Howard, for this very clear perspective and clear hypothesis we are going to discuss afterwards. Before we do so we move now to Timothy. Timothy Lubanga. You are a Commissioner for Monitoring and Evaluation at the Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda. So you are working really at the interface of knowledge systems and organizing politics and policies. So we are keen to listen to you and your experiences when it comes to this kind of interchanges. Timothy,
Thank you very
please.
much. And thank you also to the Global Development Network for inviting us to participate in this event. My comments are going to be informed by also my role in a regional program in Africa called Twende Mbele, where we are working with 6 and hoping to expand to about 8 countries on promoting collaboration and cooperation developing national evaluation systems through learning and sharing experiences. And so I'm going to bring some of my experience in managing that institution in this discussion. So my first point is about the issue of the linkage between the global development challenges and the work that is done by scientists and research, especially in developing countries. Why is there such a huge gap between the work of researchers, research institutions, and the development challenge they are facing in developing countries? I think the first issue of concern is that the public policy making framework has provided very little space for science and for researchers. So in many of the developing economies, priority setting at the public policy planning is not informed by research, it's not informed by evidence, but it's more driven by other political considerations. And that is a problem. So from the word go, research and the value of evidence is not prioritized in the public policy environment. And that means there is very little use of research, there is very little value attached to the investments that is placed on research. So the universities, the research agencies, research institutions struggle to find their results incorporated in the public policy making process. So I think that is one very big challenge. The second issue is that in many of these countries that we still rely on donor assistance, most of the aid still comes with a lot of restrictions and giving very little room for the priorities of the countries to influence the development agenda. And the result, therefore, is that these countries are just forced to comply. And when a situation arises like that, then there is very little room again for the researchers to enter into and influence the public policy making process. Then the third point, I think, which is also paramount in this, is that our governments in developing countries have not developed the local structures and local institutions. They have not supported the local structures and local institutions to grow. And so because these institutions are struggling, they have limited capacity. In many cases, they don't have adequate funding, and they have a lot of constraints that they face. So their capacity to develop and train enough researchers locally to take advantage of indigenous knowledge, to take advantage, for example, of new development in IT and so on. We are struggling, for example, on how to use big data. Even the national statistical bureaus are struggling to deal with the big data that is now available from telephone companies and all these sources, and how to actually generate information out of that data that can actually be used in decision making. And maybe the next point I would like to share is the point that was also raised in the morning here about working a lot in silos. And I'll use an example to demonstrate this. In my country, for example, the agricultural research institutions established by government have done a great job in generating new varieties that are drought resistant of crops and are resistant to pests and diseases and so on. However, most of this technology has not been translated into, have not been transmitted to the farmers. So the farmers are still using outdated methods of farming and not taking advantage of the new varieties and new technologies that are generated. So the question is, why does government and development partners invest so much resources in this new technology and not transmit it to the farmers? So that's a demonstration of how institutions are working as silos. The Ministry of Agriculture has actually a mechanism for adopting technology and ensuring that that is rolled out to the public. But that is not functioning, it's not supported, it's not funded. So the issue of limited integration, limited coordination, poor coordination within the government structures and the public sector is a big problem. And finally, there is a huge opportunity in working with the private sector, which is also not tapped. The private sector is, of course, profit-driven, but they cannot take the initiative to do public policy programs. They cannot take the initiative to mobilize the society, for example, to adopt new technology and to inform the national research agenda. They are willing to fund research as long as it will contribute to the improvement of their investments and so on. But again, I think we have had a weakness in terms of coordinating the efforts of the the private sector, and taking advantage of the resources and the potential that exists there to ensure that research and evidence is used more in public policy and informing development in the countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Timothy, for your insights into your experiences from your country perspective, but also from the perspective of the interfaces between knowledge systems and policy, real policy making. Now we are moving to Peter, last but not at all least, of course. Peter Taylor, you are a director of the strategic development at the International Development Research Center, IDRC, which we all know, admire, and are looking at when it comes to research programs, funding, and learning from best practices. So what is your take on all of that?
So I think one observation is from the beginning that it's very interesting listening to all of us. We're taking different views of a complex system and speaking to that. So I guess the challenge for all of us is to try to understand, can we bring all of that together and get some overview of what this complex system looks like? So IDRC sits within a Canadian funding system. We're part of the Canadian International Development Assistance family. We work very closely with government agencies, but also with civil society, with universities, with a range of different institutions, private sector. And we locate ourselves within that as part of a set of actors who have a common purpose to try to support the emergence of knowledge, innovation, and solutions that will bring about positive change in people's lives, particularly in lower middle income countries. So our mandate, although we sit within the Canadian system, is to support emergence and strengthening of systems in a range of different parts of the world, and also part of this global system of research for development, which is hopefully contributing evidence and data analysis, which is actually helping to bring positive transformations. Maybe just to give a couple of examples of how we're attempting to support the emergence of knowledge and evidence systems as our mandate calls it, regions of the developing world. But I think we're grappling still with that, with terminology around how to describe this. The first one, the think tank initiative, is an example of where we provided support over a 10-year period to almost 50 policy research organizations or think tanks in Latin America, in South Asia, and in Africa. And the basic principle of the think tank initiative is that within any knowledge and evidence ecosystem in any national context, there are a number of different actors. So where are those actors going to be able to strengthen themselves on the path towards sustainability so that they can continue to be contributors of high quality evidence and data using methodologies of the kind that Howard raised, robust, rigorous, really trying to demonstrate where the evidence gaps are within that evidence architecture, but also engaging with other actors within the system. And one thing that's very clear to us, aside from our ability to contribute longer term flexible funding, which I think is a hugely important attribute for any organization to receive, is for the ability for that organization to understand and to practice different parts of the research process, which involves not only generating high quality research, which is crucial for impact, but also engaging with different actors in society, and that includes policy actors, the media, civil society, and ensuring that different societal actors are engaged in the research process throughout. So that involves working at the system, which is itself a challenge and requires skills, competences, capabilities, which are not easy for individual researchers to acquire, for organizations to acquire, and also for the system to facilitate and enable that. Just now in this panel session, we had the parallel session before this one, there was a lot of discussion around how researchers can engage with the state apparatus, particularly in contexts where research and evidence is being discredited, where research is being marginalized, where even robust evidence, which is backed up by good reviews, is not taken seriously because there's a general concern about the value of data and evidence for decision making. So that's a feature of the life of policy research organizations, and how do they work with that. Another strand is around, of work is around our support to science granting councils in 15 science granting councils in Africa at the moment. And again, the purpose of that is to support the emergence of national science systems, which strengthens domestic support to science that can then in turn support economic and social transformation. And again, within that initiative, there are sort of different elements. How does a science granting council really strengthen its ability to manage and develop its own processes so that it becomes an effective collaborator, an effective negotiator, an effective broker with different kinds of institutions? How does it benchmark its performance against others? So, what are the opportunities for learning and exchange for science granting councils which are providing domestic support, which it may not be clear always how best to go about doing that? What kinds of partnerships can science granting councils in a range of different countries in Africa leverage, for example, with the private sector or with other actors, to get even more funding into the system so that researchers on the ground who are actually identifying the core issues which need work are able to get that kind of support? And then how do you understand overall the progress which is being made? And I think this again brings us back to the conversation that we were having earlier, for example, around the SDGs and Agenda 2030. That itself is a systemic agenda. Those goals are not silos, they are all interrelated. If you work on one, you will find synergies and trade-offs with another. And after this session, Southern Voice, which is another group which emerged out of the think tank initiative, is going to be hosting a cocktail, which I hope everybody will stay for and go to, because they'll be talking about their initiative on the state of the SDGs, and they'll be talking about a systemic view that they've been really bringing about to try to show a different way of understanding, measuring progress within a systemic perspective on the Sustainable Development Goals. The last thing I would just say as well is that something else that came up in the session this morning is that systems are about relationships. So it is about evidence, it is about data, it's about research, but it's also relationships within the system. And they're naturally dynamic, they're constantly being reconstructed, renegotiated, and there's a lot there to do with power and politics. So even though we may be feeling that we have excellent ideas, excellent evidence, and excellent data, we still have to negotiate in that complex system where relationships are very difficult. I just came across a quote from Max Planck, actually, which just reminded me that we often have very strong ideas that we think should resonate, but in the end, it's the relationships that matter. Obviously, Max Planck originally wrote this in German, but in English, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that's familiar with it. So let's not get too wedded to the power of the idea. Let's also think about the relationships which mediate our ability to bring about positive change.
Perfect. So thank you very much, of course, also to Peter and to your ideas. And I will not try to summarize before we go into the discussion now, obviously, but my feeling is that we heard about very different perspectives and many examples and many experiences, but again and again, I listened to 4 different dimensions here. And I would like to listen to your comments on these different kinds of dimensions, or there are other ones which we missed in this discussion until now. And in addition to that, to the questions and comments from your side, please also think about ideas which you would have, very concretely maybe, on how to develop further the Global Development Network, because you are moving into the 3rd decade of your existence now. So based on what you have been listening here on the panel and what you are thinking about, what could be interesting and fresh ideas when it comes to the future of the global development network. No? So the 4 dimensions which I listening to you, or which I saw, is on the one hand side, something like the ingredients and characteristics of what research needed to look like, being confronted with delivering on the SDGs and sustainable development. No? Many elements here. So from transdisciplinarity to excellency, the stakeholders. So all of you talked about this actually. No? Omar, you mentioned this, and Simone, you emphasized this very strongly. The second element which also came up, and Peter and Howard, you strongly emphasized those, which is obviously very important, the scale of financing. No? We might have many brilliant ideas. We might have very interesting initiatives here or there, but in many contexts, Timothy, you also emphasized this, and Omar, finance, no? Financing and scale, and where are the funders which we need to move forward in all our fields. No? The third element which Howard reflected upon is what you call the evidence architecture. And your strong hypothesis is that we have one field where we really do it excellently, and all the others needed to learn from this. And you mentioned health. No? So is this what others agree upon? I would be interested to listen to voices. And the fourth dimension has been, and again, several of you elaborated on that and alluded this, science systems and knowledge systems are never decoupled from political contexts. Now, Peter, you mentioned this. Timothy, you talked about national political systems and how they leverage or use or don't use science systems and knowledge, and also the ODA dimension, coming with many conditionalities into countries. No? So the politics of using science and interacting with science, a very interesting aspect, I think. So with this, I would like to move towards the auditorium. We have 40 minutes for discussion now, and I'm looking around in our plenary to listen to the first comments and voices and questions. And please remember, concrete ideas for developing further GDN, very welcomed. No? First one here, right over in front. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa Babikir. I have some comments and maybe one question. I think one important issue that have been touched on but not really flushed is the question of incentives. Yeah, what are the incentives for researchers to produce fast-track research related to sustainability? Okay? So we have some problems. We see that multidisciplinary is maybe the framework to produce research on sustainability. But the problem with multidisciplinary is that the research that you do may not account for your career or profession in terms of tenure or something. You don't get that thing. So that will be an issue. Another issue will be the funding. And I think here we didn't answer this question yesterday we had about the self-selection bias in terms of funding and research. And this is when if you question what the source of the funding, from where you get the funding. Mm-hmm. Is it the funding, is it national funding or international funding? And if it's national or international funding, each one would come with some connotation. What are the areas of interest? And this will be very important when we think about sustainability, which has a lot of aspect from the developing countries' perspective, but also from developed countries' perspective, and how to screen out those incentives will be something very important. So I would like the panelists, if they can comment more on these two issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to bundle some comments and questions, and then we move into the group here again and have some iterations. So the second voice comes from my right-hand side here.
Thank you. When GDN was set up, two of the issues which were emphasized one was multidisciplinarity, and the other was plurality. And I would say plurality, particularly topics, methodologies, and so on. So what I would like actually the panelists is to be much more interactive, because I see that there are competing views. So for instance, Howard White comes back to RCTs. Maybe you didn't we're not suggesting it, but what came across is RCTs are the only ways to evaluate. And we've already heard, and you recognize that it's a good thing to have RCTs in the basket, but also there are serious problems. Stiglitz talked about it, Angus Deaton, but many others. And even in medical research, we are now talking about cocktails of drugs. So we're not talking about one solution or one intervention. So whereas you have, I think Peter Taylor talked about complex systems, Tricia Williams talks about interdisciplinarity, and I would like you to challenge each other a little bit on that. And I would like in GDN really to have much more debate on differences and to see where we emerge on that, because I feel we don't have enough sharpness yet in our intellectual debates. I think everybody's being just too nice to each other, so I'd like them to be more challenging as well.
Okay, good. So we try to be sharp and conflictive, but polite, no? Very good, okay. First round, one more question for the first round? If not, we go back with this basket of first comments and questions to the plenary here. So, who would like to pick up issues? We have the incentive question, we have the funding issue, we have the element of plurality, and we need more controversies, and challenging the evidence architecture question. Right. Good. So, you are not challenging yourself, but you are re-emphasizing what you wanted to say. Howard, please.
Thank you. So, I've always been a proponent of mixed methods. I was invited to present to the GGM board back in 2001 on mixed methods and funding other disciplines. Yes, you remember? Maybe I do. And so I'm not a randomista. I believe very strongly that there's different types of evidence that answer different types of questions, and that's precisely the point, and we can all agree that. The type of evidence or research most appropriate depends on the research question. There's no disagreement about that. When we're looking at the effectiveness of interventions, then randomized controlled trials do have particular merits, but interestingly, we had our own event last week, what was Global Summit in Mexico, and the key takeaway to me from that event was that people who our key proponents of impact evaluation, people like Santiago Levy, who was one of our keynote speakers, are actually talking about the need to go beyond RCTs to understand more complex interactions of interventions. And so I think we do see the debate moving in the direction of recognizing, and I run another program called CEDAW, where we're funding a large number of mixed method impact evaluations. So there's a much stronger recognition of the role of mixed methods in that space. But more fundamentally is actually the question of disciplinarity and supporting other disciplines, and that came up in the previous session I was in as well. So the support that we see coming from development agencies, from donors, researchers, is mainly towards economics, bit to political science, anthropology, history. I love history, and I think history, a good understanding of history is really important to national identity. And the failure to invest in local research in history in universities is again, another scandal. And I've always thought that GDN actually ought to take up that banner and not have such a strong economics focus as it has done. And say, but what about the historians? What about the anthropologists? Why can't we be also funding research in these areas?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Howard. Timothy.
Okay, thank you. So I will reflect a little on the point raised on what are the incentives for researchers to produce sustainably. I think the biggest incentive in our case would be if demand for the research increased as a result of the research findings, and if that demand was translated into an actual implementation of the research findings. And let me give an example. Let's say a researcher produced a new variety of coffee plants or coffee seedlings, and the new variety is more productive and more drought resistant. And government actually approved a policy that requires all farmers to adopt and use the new variety. I think that would be the biggest incentive to that researcher or the research institution, because first, demand is created as a result of the research, and secondly, the findings of the research are actually put to action through a government policy. So in my view, the biggest incentive is if there is demand for this research. But the other second incentive is, to what extent is the research influencing other disciplinary research action on a related topic? For example, again, in our case, we have a student who invented a system for testing malaria that does not require pricking. Because as of now, to test for malaria, they will still have to prick and get a little blood sample. And so this was a very good innovation, and it has been taken up. But questions are now around, why don't we also find similar technology for testing other common diseases without necessarily having to prick? And so if there is that linkage, I think that would be a huge incentive to the researchers. And briefly on the issue of funding, we have an interesting scenario in Uganda where when at the climax of the HIV/AIDS outbreak, there was a lot of funding that was available for research on HIV/AIDS. And what it did is it distorted the research environment within the health sector, because all the big researchers in the health sector went into HIV/AIDS research. And it caused a big gap into research on other health. And our biggest problem is malaria, for example. So instead of putting more resources on research on malaria, most of the research was focused on HIV/AIDS, and including investment in service delivery overall within the health sector. So that is a big distortion that was created because of a short-term availability of resources. So I think the point here is that I think the onus is on government to really make sure there is a good balance in managing the resources available for research in a particular sector, but also that there is a kind of a targeted drive towards focusing adequate resources to invest in a multidisciplinary investment in research. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Omar?
Yeah, I would like to add to that. In the case of Latin America and in Panama, we do have a platform that recognizes productivity of researchers, and we provide incentives for researchers to go not only in one direction, but all areas of knowledge, social sciences, medical, public health, agriculture, and natural sciences and engineering. So you provide an incentive for them to do research with certain excellence criteria. Now the question is, how do we make them go now for the transdisciplinary research? And is that incentive enough? I don't know, because again, like Simone said, they need to be evaluated in their academic systems to get promoted, and it comes back to this question: it's like, are we evaluating them in their academic systems in a fair way that does not divert them from, reaching to the sustainable goals? So that's we need to do a re-engineering on that, and we need to do adaptive management in terms of still provide incentives so that they don't lose their identity as academics, but they also contribute to the sustainable development goals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Omar. Simone and Peter, you also wanted? Yeah.
I like the aspect of being challenging, maybe not only within this group, but also challenge ourselves in thinking, what are our incentives for research? And I believe my first answer would have been, Yeah, because I like to work on sustainability, and I was educated in such a way that I'm able to, let's say, find some challenging topic, but probably that very much depends on my personal background and environment. As you said, in Uganda you have certain topics that you are strong in working on. Probably that's the same for my German background and let's say environment I was academically raised in. So the point is always where do we come from, but also where do we get the funding from? I guess the whole room would agree on research on sustainability is very important. But what aspects exactly? And that's where the discussion might then start and where we may even disagree in the very end. So what exactly are the topics to be worked on? And that depends very much on where do we get the funding from. Again, from my German background, I'm in a quite luxurious situation with a lot of funding sources. But again, they are very often, we are third-party dependent, so we are limited to certain, let's say, sources, but then also topic dependent. So freely available sources are getting less, I would argue, again, from a very sophisticated standpoint. And that's even worse in other countries where funding sources are even more limited and where you may be dependent on humanitarian or, let's say, development funds. So that is something we have to keep in mind, and that determines the research we're doing, but also the gaps which are probably still existent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Simone. Peter, you wanted to pick up one of these issues?
Yeah, well, I appreciate Bina's point about us being more challenging and engaging more. I think having a rather high-level conversation allows us to move into our safe territories, but if we started focusing down on specific issues, we'd probably find some quite particular things that we'd have some healthy and constructive debates around. I was interested, actually, I hadn't thought about this knowledge architecture for fast-tracking sustainability, which is an interesting way of putting it, actually, because I guess there are urgent issues just now. I mean, climate is one that I think we're confronted with that is clearly requiring very urgent action if we are actually to try to attempt to reverse the kind of current trends that we're seeing. But the sustainability that we want to see will only be understood in the longer term. So someone, a participant in the earlier panel that we had this afternoon, mentioned that we hadn't heard too much about the idea of leaving no one behind so far in these 2 days. Raised the very good point that researchers will need not only to generate with a range of different actors and co-create knowledge which has value for use, which can actually address challenges now, but will also understand what are the results or what are the outcomes from actions which emanate from the use of that data. And if we think about the idea of leave no one behind by 2030, well, we know there will be people who will be left behind by 2030. The question is, do we wait until 2030 and then decide, okay, now we have a whole new research agenda because we suddenly realized there are millions, possibly billions of people who've been left behind? Or do we start to now actually identifying what those issues are and within our respective systems trying to understand how can we contribute to supporting research, to undertaking research that not only identifies what the issue is, but feeds and informs policies and practices which can then be tested and the implications of that actually understood and you know, leading to further research and further action. In terms of the incentives for researchers, I definitely empathize with that question, having been previously working in the university environment and soon going back to one again, then I completely understand the imperatives for individual researchers to satisfy the metrics which is required of them. The one thing I would say is that I hope we will gradually see a broadening and a more nuanced view of what research quality actually means. And just to share with everyone, IDRC has recently, in collaboration with a number of other people, has been developing a framework called Research Quality Plus. It's an evaluative framework, and the purpose is not only to look at research quality from the narrow view of let's call it the integrity, so the rigor part of it, that is hugely important, but the other dimensions of the ability for it to be legitimate in terms of the ethics, in terms of engaging with different, let's say, marginalized groups, or ensuring diversity is there, or ensuring gender equality is there, also ensuring that it's positioned for use, and that all of those are valid dimensions of quality. So if the metrics by which researchers' career development and professional development prospects are measured actually relate to that broader understanding of research quality, then it follows that perhaps a researcher who might follow a more engaged research approach, which contributes towards fast-tracking sustainability in some way, would actually be recognized and valued and rewarded in terms of professional development. So I think there's something around the metrics and the measurement associated with professional and career development which needs to be reimagined, I would say.
Good, good. Thank you very much. Second round of comments and questions. Yeah, first here, directly in front of me, then you, and...
Yeah, Manny Jimenez at 3IE. Timothy and then now Peter, you mentioned this tendency for the short term and the urgent to crowd out the long term, which is really critical, especially if you're talking about sustainability. My question is, given that the ones who actually have to make decisions about funding research have a much shorter horizon, some say 4 years, whatever the election cycle happens to be, do you have any stories of hope for us? Are there examples that we might look to see where there might be some leverage that we as researchers can have on the decision-making process? And maybe that's a question to the whole panel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much for your question. The next one is here.
Yes, maybe to build up a bit on Mani's comment, years ago I was involved in a guide, the Good Enough Guide to Impact Assessment. So what is good enough? We cannot be perfect, in particular when you have to be there at the right time. In the humanitarian sector, what we did for some time, we did what we called lessons learned reports, where we quickly assessed the evidence that was out there in terms of what worked and what didn't work, for what reason in humanitarian action, and fed it back right at the time when a new emergency was relevant. So immediate input into the operations on the ground, and that was very successful. So really timeliness, as Maximo yesterday was discussing, is crucial. We are also doing evidence mapping, if I want to call it more broadly, in the UN, looking at evaluative evidence coming out of evaluations. And we did recently a meta-synthesis of evaluations on equity in education, SDG 4.5. We found 800 evaluations since 2015. A lot of them project evaluations, so small stuff that it's like apples and oranges or even smaller. That was interesting, but it had issues. A, there were small project evaluations. They didn't answer the big questions. B, they had quality issues. Some were very good, some were not so good. So how do you factor in the quality and the kind of evidence mapping you're doing? Because even with research that's more rigorous, you still will have quality issues. And then also coming retroactively, not having common evaluation or research questions is an issue. So as we were discussing in an earlier session today, the need to be forward-looking, to guess now what are going to be the issues that are important is really important. And I do think there's actually the researcher we hired, it was an academic to do this meta-synthesis, walked away with actually saying, there's a lot of master's theses out there. I didn't realize these evaluations were there, and we're not using them. It's gray literature. It's not perfect, but it's out there. So how can we bring in the so-called gray literature and put it all to good use, would be my main question.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for your comments and additional information about the issue which we are discussing. Next question here in front, please.
So I'd like to touch on two issues. One is the push and one is the pull for getting to this sustainable or trans research endeavors. So, I mean, we've heard about evaluations and promotional strategies from Peter, aligning institutions to have the academics function in the kind of way that would be aligned with policies. We've also touched on grants a little bit. Just a comment. The European Commission in their last program, Horizon 2020, had a very small section that included some of the SDG goals. It was science with and for society in the criteria. At this point, they haven't confirmed any criteria for SDGs within a funding program, which could be up to 100 billion euros, which would be a real impact. Yeah. So that's the push. Now, the pull element is that if we think about things from just a faculty perspective or professor, they're training an incredible amount of students. Students come into the system, and they're usually passionate about a certain disease that they want to study or something, and then they get put into these silos, and then they get swallowed up in those silos and are forever lost in their theses. How do we maintain this type of pull and enthusiasm that's scalable, meaning you have so many students in the system that could be so effective, but most of them will leave academia, but then they need a job. How do we address that capacity?
Okay, good. Thank you very much for your two questions. I have another one here, Ramona.
Thank you. I have a question about the role of the private sector. We've actually talked quite little about it over the last almost 2 days now. So in the context of this knowledge architecture for fast-tracking sustainability, what is the role of the private sector? Is it just as a potential provider of funding? And is it maybe a source of data? Is it a source of knowledge from implementation? We've touched really very little on the private sector, and we don't have many private sector representatives among us, but maybe that's a question that somebody from the panel can pick up.
Okay, thank you very much. There would be time for one more point, one more question or comment. Is there? Where? Okay, sorry, I didn't see you. Yeah, then here comes the last question or comment, and then we go back to the plenary, and you can pick and choose. Yeah.
Maybe I add to this question, because we have a specific case mentioned by Mr. Lubanga. Do you have a private sector involved in your plant breeding in Uganda? Because I think it's very important whether how you transfer research or public research into, let's say, into action, into use. But that would be my specific question in this case. Do you have only or mainly based public research and variety creation, or do you have already private sector involved? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we take all these questions, and I would like to give it back to you, to the panelists. And all of you have around 1.5 to 2 minutes to answer those, so plenty of time. Concentrate. And we start with Simone and then move to the left. Simone.
Okay, then I take the liberty not answering all the questions, but I appreciate very much the one on the grey literature and how we tackle theses and how we keep the momentum of students and the motivation. I guess that's very much linked to each other, because from my personal perspective, supervising students, they were most motivated when they knew their thesis is not just for me, we're handing in one copy and then it ends up in the nirvana. Maybe they get a good grade, but that's it. But those students for whom we found a thesis together, either with private sector or with other UN agencies, are working on a concrete project, and we could find a research question that really could support making a change on the ground. They were most motivated, and then those theses, of course, with the consent of the student, were also handed to those agencies. And I believe that could be one opportunity which is a little more challenging for academia, because it's just not finding some research like wherever, but really having a network, and that builds then now in my previous institute on a huge alumni network where previous former students then come and say, look, we have topics for students from the next generation. I guess that way, huge network can be built up and even include private sector where some students end up then.
Okay, thank you, Simone.
Well, really quickly, in 2 points, what do we do with that amount of potential that we have with the students? Well, I don't know exactly what to do, but I tell you that we identify that as a priority, and one of the problems is that you have a lot of theses that contribute a significant amount of knowledge that is not available. One of the limitations, for example, in my country and many developing countries is that those data are not available. So we implement in repository and open data and open science strategies in order to bring that information and make it more available. On the private sector, coffee is one of the commodities, and trying to involve the private sector has been tricky. It's tricky, and they do believe in research, and they do believe in transformative research that makes them better for their needs and their competitiveness. But they don't want to put money unless they see that the government put some money. So it's a relationship that needs some some dynamics that we are trying to establish in order to them see the researchers in the country that are capable of helping them on those issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Omar. Howard.
There's a question about grey literature and so on. So Cochrane, which works on systematic reviews in health, was started in 1994, Campbell in 2000. So between them, they've put many, many years, academic years, into thinking about how to do systematic reviews to minimize the risk of bias in doing those reviews. And we have standards on how reviews should be conducted. Now, historically, we've mostly done effectiveness reviews, but systematic reviewing is an approach that can be applied to any research question. It doesn't have to just be reviews of RCTs, it can be also reviews of prevalence studies, qualitative studies on what we call barriers of facilitation and so on. And in the last few years, you've seen a growth of systematic reviews in development circles, partly driven by 3IE and evidence mapping, particularly was driven by 3IE. And the great shame is that this growth is being done in ignorance of or ignoring these standards, because these standards are there to minimize the risk of bias when you do evidence synthesis. And if you ignore them, then your study's at risk of bias. And that matters not just because you don't come to us and ask us for advice, it matters because you actually get studies that are therefore are wrong. And that matters because when I go out and present a study saying we can see that payment for our environmental services is an extremely cost-ineffective intervention, someone can stand up and say, and this happened to me, oh no, but there's a review by EBA, the Swedish group, showing that they're effective. I looked at that review, it's just highly flawed. And if people are going out and doing low-quality evidence synthesis, policymakers will say, well, you've got different reviews on the same topic saying different things, so I don't trust systematic reviews. And that's a very bad position for us to be in, so we need to ensure people do high-quality reviews following proper standards. Best of all, registered with Cochrane and Campbell, that will ensure you follow the standards. And of course, I have a vested interest in saying that. But part of our standards is you have to include grey literature. And you have to consult an information specialist who knows how to find grey literature, including master's and doctoral theses. As most academics resent this, when I came into systematic reviewing, I thought, well, I know how to search, I know how to find literature. I don't. Information specialists know how to, and you have to include them in your reviews. So this grey literature does get included. We know there's huge publication bias in all literatures, much greater chance of getting published if you have significant findings. And so if you exclude the non-published studies, you have a higher risk of bias. Secondly, when you do a review, you have to do what we call critical appraisal of included studies. There's a whole range of checklists available for different study designs, for RCTs, for non-experimental impact evaluations, for qualitative studies, to assess the quality of those studies. And any review published with Cochrane or Campbell has to include a critical appraisal of the included studies, and you actually have to show how the difference in study quality may mediate the findings that you have. And virtually any review we have shows that the weaker the study design, the stronger the effect. And so when you do the most rigorous studies, they nearly always find a smaller effect. So the critical appraisal really, really matters. And it's standard in Cochrane and Campbell reviews. Most other reviews don't even do it.
Okay, thank you, Howard. Timothy?
Yeah, thank you. I'll reflect on two issues. The first one is what Mani raised on the tendency for the short-term research objectives, crowding out the long-term objectives. In my view and in my experience, the solution is for the governments themselves to budget some resources for R&D. And in my case, for example, we are seeing an increased budget annually for a research on particular topics that the president is interested in, unfortunately. One of them One of them is on the banana research. I think for the last 10 years, there's a group of researchers that have been funded through the national budget on banana research. And the idea is to process bananas into a powder form and to process the stems into feeds and all sorts of, there are many aspects of that research. But because it is embedded in the national budget, in the national development plan, those funds can survive longer, 10, 15 years. We are also seeing a new fund called a Research and Innovation Fund for innovation in science and technology, and is supporting a number of research institutions. In fact, some professors have abandoned their work at universities and come basically to work around this fund. We haven't seen many products from this for a while, but at least those funds exist for a longer time. So I think that's a solution at the national level. At the global level, maybe Peter will talk about dealing with that problem. And finally, the role of the private sector. I want to admit that this is a big challenge. As I speak now in my country, the president is presiding over what they call an SDG day. So we have a big celebration to discuss and take stock of our preparedness to implement SDGs and to highlight the SDG agenda and so on. And when we were planning for this event, we invited the private sector. And okay, generally the private sector is small. In many developing countries, in our country, the private sector is small. So it is dominated by a few big investors who are in the manufacturing sector, and the rest are really small. Most of them are SMEs and which don't have resources, adequate resources to invest in research. But even the small as they are and organized as they are, they don't really understand, for example, on SDGs, what their roles are. So it was very difficult for us to explain what SDGs are, how we are mainstreaming it in the national planning process, what their role should be, and so it's a big challenge. So I want to admit that this is an area that is not very clear yet, and we are grappling with it. However, we are making efforts because we know, for example, the same private sector have been complaining to government during the budgeting and the budgeting process why very few or a very small percentage of the private sector has to shoulder the biggest tax burden. A lot of the informal sector or the small SMEs cannot be reached to be taxed. So they feel this is a burden. And so when government wanted to understand the implications of this and research on this, the private sector funded a study. And the study was very useful and in guiding government on how to actually address the concerns of the private sector. So I think the potential is there if we can have a good entry point of bringing them to decide on the research agenda, to be part of the research policy. But it's a difficult area, and it's a gray area that we are grappling with. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Timothy. Peter.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if it's room for hope, but this question of short-term versus long-term, and perhaps an example of room for hope is IDRC. What I've been involved in, particularly over the last year, is helping to develop our next strategy, and our next strategy is going to be a 10-year strategy for the first time. We've always had 5-year strategies. This time it will be a 10-year strategy. A lot of debate about that. Should it, some organizations will say, no, things are changing so fast, 2 years is enough, because you couldn't even predict 2 years from now what the world will look like. So our argument is, take the analogy of a plane. Many of you probably increasing our collective carbon footprint have flown here. And when you depart, I flew from Ottawa to London, and if the pilot said, well, we're going on a journey, we're going to take off, and then we'll think about where we're going along the way, and we'll let you know. That would be quite worrying. But so we get that overall trajectory of a sense that, yes, we're leaving Ottawa now, and in this period of time, we're going to land in London. Now, I trust that the pilots of the plane will be able to direct and ensure that we arrive in the place we're going to over that period of time. But along the way, there's turbulence, there are other factors, storms could arise, needs for evasive action of different kinds. And I trust that, there will be it's sufficient flexibility and agility and responsiveness of the pilots to ensure that they're adjusting and responding to those particular things. So that's the view that we're taking. We want to have that broad view because we understand that we won't see the outcomes of much of the research that we fund until much later. Some will be much beyond a 10-year period in any case. But we also want to ensure that we're really positioning ourselves to be supportive to researchers in a range of different contexts who are identifying now what they see as those big picture issues. But as we go along, of course, as new imperatives arise, we should be able to be flexible and to adjust, but still keep that overall sense of a strategic trajectory. So I'm not sure if that's room for hope or not, but that's how we're approaching it. On the grey literature part, yes, I think again in the last parallel session we had, one of the issues that came up was, who do we speak to and who do we engage with when we're actually understanding what evidence is out there. So, of course, some methodological processes will pick up evidence from a wide range of sources, but it was pointed out that there are, for example, civil society actors, social movements, who are often engaging in evidence generation processes, but the material that they generate, firstly, may still reside in the grey literature zone, but also they're often not engaged with to actually find out what it is, the work that they've been doing, what could they contribute. So being much more, I think, creative and much more engaged with a diverse and inclusive range of actors enables us to start tapping into where some of that grey literature might be. On the private sector, we've been having a lot of debate about that because for sure, IDRC as a funding organization, we already engage with the private sector, and of course we're thinking a lot about what engagement with the private sector could look like. And we're looking at it in two broad ways. Actually, we did a sort of categorization, and it's not just about funding coming from the private sector. There's a lot of other dimensions of the relationship that can come from the private sector. So, for example, it could be around supporting an enabling environment for the private sector to actually play a role in working, with evidence, with data, which is actually being generated. It could be around just engaging in research and dialogue with the private sector about what their needs and aspirations are and how they see that they may be able to contribution for the public good. It could be to do with looking at technical cooperation from the private sector, which is in relation to an innovation, for example, which has been generated where there's a genuine competitive reason for the private sector to engage and promote that to achieve some positive outcomes at scale. Or it could be partnering with the private sector. And that last one perhaps is the one that we automatically think about doing, but I think it's only one of those elements. And there's a big tranche of work which I think is around actually what we're thinking about is we call it pre-competitive engagement. So it's actually looking at the landscape where different parts of the private sector may engage and understanding to what extent are they able to engage. Is that a sphere in which they can operate? And then competition may emerge through that process because some companies or some businesses may demonstrate a higher capacity than others to perform well. But in general, there may not even be a realization yet that there is a field which the private sector can engage in. So first of all, it's almost like preparing the ground for private sector engagement, and then the second is about seeing other opportunities within that where there's a definite comparative advantage of one part of the private sector to take something forward. So that's something we're really interested in, but we're trying to approach it in a more nuanced way, and not just to lump it all into the idea of, okay, it's about getting money from the private sector, because I think that's just one dimension. And then the last thing I'll just say on the, how to draw on the capacity of passionate students. I think about this a lot. I've got two daughters who are in their early 20s, both at university, and I'm thinking, are they going to live in my basement for the rest of their lives? It's a real challenge. They're both very passionate about what they do, and what will their contribution be? I think part of that contribution that I hope will come out of their education is that they're going to become active citizens. I think we will all suffer the consequences if we don't have an active citizenry in the future, who will be fueled by young people now who are using the skills and the knowledge that they've got around generating evaluating knowledge to understand what their role and contribution is in society. The other thing is that, I guess, going back to some of the other discussions we've had here over the last 2 days, we don't really know now what work will look like for many young people going forward. Even if we think of classic research communities, will academia look like it does now 10, 20, 30 years from now? It's hard to know. We imagine it will continue looking in the same realm, but with changes in information technology, new roles of interacting, new forms of media, I suspect that much of this will change. So are young people who are going through educative processes being prepared to be flexible and to have the transferable skills that will enable them to be much more agile in a very uncertain future?
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Peter. We need to come to an end. I think we had a very fruitful and creative discussion about ourselves, our own systems, and there is still a lot to look at in the future. But now we move into a controversy. There has been a question about more controversies. Now we will have a controversy about geoengineering, and please don't leave the room. No? It's a controversial issue, I can promise you, and we have good speakers around it. Please stay here, and we will only change the setting here, but a big thank you goes to all of you for your questions and comments, obviously, but specifically to the plenary and your excellent contributions to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is this on? Great. So yes, please do not leave the room. We don't have a coffee break now. We go straight into the climate engineering controversy. We have one of our panelists who, partly in the interest of saving the carbon footprint, partly because of his travel schedule, could not join us in person. And he's joining us live on video from New Delhi. And I will turn over to the chair of the session, Professor Mikhailova. After this, we will have a cocktail outside, so you're not too far away from some food and drinks and the chance to network and interact. So don't leave. We do have 2 more exciting events for the day. Thank you.
On in a second. Yeah,
hopefully.
Oh, there we are.
Yeah. So hello, everyone. We are a small panel. We are a controversy here. So 2 people are enough to form a controversy. And hello, Arunabha. Do you hear us?
Hi, can you hear me?
So greetings to Delhi. And we have Jesse Reynolds and Arunava Ghosh, but I'll introduce you later. Let me first get into the topic itself, because I think for most of you, this is going to be something you've probably not heard about. And so I was asked to give a mini introduction. My name is Katarina Michailova. I'm from the University of Zurich. And actually, I'm not an expert on that topic. I do some work on climate, international climate policy, but certainly not on geoengineering, on climate engineering. But that's why we have the experts here who will clarify these things. Still, I'm going to try to get us into the topic, and then our experts will help me and let us see whether I got this right. Now I need my slide, yes. So initially, I mean, what you all know, I think, is this slide in the background, which I just put up from the IPCC, and this is just a projection about the temperature raise if we go on as we do right now, and what people think we might probably go on as. And you see that we're going to approach this 1.5 objective of the Paris Agreement pretty soon. And well, a number of people are actually pretty pessimistic that there is anything to do against it if we just go for the traditional mitigation policy options that we have. So the question then is, and this is actually what this whole issue of climate engineering is about, if we fail to achieve emission reductions required for this 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement, then can we engineer a solution? And I think the terminology itself, in a way, shows that this is a topic that has been discussed quite a bit, I guess, in natural sciences, in engineering, but for some reason hasn't made it really into social sciences. And I think we need that debate, and that's actually why we brought it up here. So some people actually seem to believe this engineering, climate engineering, or some call it geoengineering, could be some kind of a magic bullet to achieve for us what policies haven't achieved so far. So let me get into what is actually climate engineering. There are two basic things that we understand under climate engineering. One thing is negative emission technologies. So basically, it's some removal of the CO2 that we already have out there. And there are some things everyone knows, like large-scale afforestation, carbon capture and storage. There are different ways for that. You can take it kind of out of the air and store it somewhere in the ground, or you can kind of store it in the ocean by fertilizing the oceans, getting the algae grow, and more of this. And then there is the second part, and we're probably discussing this more here today, which is called solar radiation modification, or solar geoengineering. And this is basically increasing the reflection of the sun back into the atmosphere to counteract the warming. So yeah, I mean, we keep basically the CO2 we have, but we try to counteract the warming anyway. And here's a picture to depict a couple of methods that are under discussion in this context. Well, again, one very simple issue is you can paint the roofs of your houses in white. That adds reflection. That's obviously very simple, not very problematic either, probably also not very helpful. I mean, there's only so much you can achieve with this. Similarly, some people have figured out that you could change the color of the plants, make them lighter. Then you'll have more reflection. And then we get into the more complex and more debated issues, but still things we can actually do, as far as I understand, that technologically we can do, which is actually, well, kind of, well, as Jesse says, I saw in his book, mimicking volcanoes. So kind of spitting up aerosols in the atmosphere, in the stratospheric area, well, adding clouds, making clouds clearer, these kind of things. And then some people, in addition, are also, well, trying to develop technologies where you could have some kind of sunsheds, some kind of umbrellas floating around even higher up and protecting us from the sunshine. So the problem is those technologies that are relatively risk-free, the easy ones like painting your roofs white or in a way planting more trees as long as we have space for that, they have relatively few side effects on other SDGs, but at the same time they have a very limited potential, and they will take time to become effective. And then we have this other part, the solar radiation modification. Notably, when you start injecting these aerosols into the stratosphere, which actually is supposed to have a high potential to reduce warming, works quickly, and is relatively cheap, but then also risky. And that's where I think the controversy comes from. And I think this is really something we can debate, because you can have different positions on this. And well, I mean, since there has been so little debate, then obviously these things are not clear. And I think we, as mostly social scientists here in this room, should get more onto this issue and help clarify things here. So it's really a knowledge issue as well from that perspective. So I'm turning to the experts now, which I'm going to introduce in a sec, and then we are going to that first question where they can help explain what it's all about, and then discuss these pros and cons of this climate engineering, and specifically this stratospheric aerosol injection issue, given the trade-off between the risks of climate change and the risks of this solar aerosol injection itself. So now let me come to our two experts. So actually I've put them together on this slide because they're a little far away here in the room, or until Delhi. So let me start with Arunabha Ghosh, who is an Oxford and St. Stephen's College trained economist at the basis, but who is much better known now as the CEO of the Council on Energy and Environment and Water, CEEW, which she actually founded in 2010, and which came up as a major internationally highly renowned think tank in the last couple of years. Actually, it's quite amazing how you can bring up a think tank in so few years to, well, such an important institution. He published a number of articles related to climate engineering, and that's why we are really happy to have you on the podium here tonight. To my left, we have Jesse Reynolds, who has a very interdisciplinary background. He studied law, environmental science, policy, management, even chemistry, as if I read this correctly, and who is currently an Emmett Frankel Fellow in Environmental Law and Policy at the University of California, Los Angeles, and I think also a research affiliate at Harvard Solar Geoengineering Research Program. And he has just recently published a book, The Governance of Solar Geoengineering, came out at Cambridge University Press in 2019, where he actually complains that social scientists are not really getting into the debate. So maybe we start with Jesse.
Sure.
Since you make the complaint, so you, you can start the discussion.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So let me add a little bit of my perspective on the climate geoengineering question. Emissions cuts alone will not keep warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's off the table. And unfortunately, emissions cuts alone are really unlikely to keep warming within 2 degrees Celsius. Those are the two targets set out in the Paris Agreement. So if you look at the scenarios that the IPCC uses, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the ones that are keeping warming relatively low have negative emissions technologies, the carbon removal methods, built in at very large scales. Now let me be clear, negative emissions can and arguably should contribute to the reduction of climate change. But in a certain way, they're not fundamentally different than emissions cuts. They lower atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. They're not a game changer. The risk, though, is they're a little uncertain because we're relying on things that haven't yet been fully developed, and they might not pan out in the future at the scales that we envision. Solar geoengineering, or SRM, on the other hand, the idea that we might be able to cool off the planet by mimicking the cooling effect of volcanoes, appears to be feasible, technically speaking, effective. That's been demonstrated already in volcanoes, which cool the planet by a degree or so when a large volcano erupts. Inexpensive, reversible in the direct climatic effects, but also uncertain, and importantly, imperfect. It would not perfectly counteract the warming effect of greenhouse gases. So I think it's important to emphasize that this is not a replacement for greenhouse gas emissions cuts, not a replacement for mitigation. It's a complement, because mitigation's not going to be enough. And this is something that appears to be able to reduce climate change in the meantime, reduce impacts in the meantime. Now, what does this mean for developing countries? We are at a forum of global development. At the grossest level, developing countries are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. If we are able to reduce climate change through emissions cuts, through negative emissions technologies, or through solar geoengineering, SRM, that stands to help developing countries disproportionately. At the same time, a common reaction that I hear, and an understandable reaction that I hear, especially from people from developing countries, is a concern that merely having this on the table, having this on the research agenda, will undermine the political will towards mitigation, that will end up with less emissions cuts than we would have had otherwise, and that it will remove the political pressure off of industrialized countries to cut their emissions like they've promised, like they should, like they must. Those two concerns, which are interrelated, are not necessarily false, but I would respond with A, there's not that much emissions cuts going on right now, and it's certainly not enough. And second, geoengineering, especially solar geoengineering, need not be the exclusive domain of industrialized countries. If it's so inexpensive, and if it's technically feasible, it's not out of the question, and quite within the question, shall I say, for developing countries to become engaged, to develop research programs, and arguably, it's not out of the question, decades forward from now, that they are also actors with the capacity to use solar geoengineering if it turns out to be appropriate. What do we do in the meantime, right? So that's talking decades out. What do we do now? It's important that developing countries and people from developing countries become more involved in international discussions and research around geoengineering, both the carbon removal stuff and especially the solar geoengineering things. There's a number of individuals and projects that are actively reaching out, trying to build bridges between research programs in Europe and North America and developing countries. I would specifically mention the SRMGI, the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, which supports research in developing countries on solar geoengineering. And if you have any questions about that program, grab me at the cocktail hour.
Thank you very much. So we get to you, Arunava. Maybe you can make an initial statement on the topic and on your views on this.
Sure, thank you, Katya. Thanks very much for having me on this panel, and thanks to Jesse for introducing the issues. You know, the panel is structured as supposedly a controversy, but so far from whatever I've heard from Jesse, I don't see anything much that I would disagree with him on. The issue, just to build on what has already been stated, Katya, you laid out the technological options that could be considered, and Jesse has laid out conditions under which there might or might not be something that could be considered. So I will just take the conversation a little further. Why is this then a controversy? And when we say that, whether it's climate geoengineering overall or more particularly solar geoengineering, the big question is, when we say it's uncertain or that its impacts are likely to be adverse in some respects and beneficent in others, what do we really mean? And we have to unpack that. Because if this is a development conference, we have to understand what is it that not just a developing country, any country should be concerned about. What we don't know to sufficient degree is what will happen to the monsoons or rainfall patterns if we were to do stratospheric injection of sulfate particles. What we don't know to sufficient degree is what will happen to the overall hydrological cycle. We don't know as a result what would happen to eventual agricultural productivity. We don't know if this will happen just 1 year or repeatedly after the start of such a large-scale intervention. We don't know what will be the impact overall on biodiversity. So our objective function cannot simply be about controlling for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. While that is very important, there are many other planetary boundaries that we have to be concerned about. We don't know fully how this will impact the ozone layer. So there are a range of uncertainties that are there, which makes this a controversial subject. Now, that's not the other problem here, and this is where I'm taking a cue from Jesse's recent book, that it's not something that scientists or natural scientists alone can resolve. Because solar geoengineering occupies what I would call a rarefied world of climate science on one hand, and the very messy world of global geopolitics. It's not one or the other. And right now we don't have any legitimate mechanisms to weigh the risks on one hand of not acting against climate emergencies, and on the other hand, of acting through a solar geoengineering method that has unknown and unintended consequences. So we don't know the risks well enough, and we don't have a legitimate political process to weigh those risks before we can decide. So this is not just a technical debate. This is, in my view, high politics. And this is exactly why, and Jesse mentioned the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, I've also been involved with it since 2010 for precisely this reason, to expand the conversation beyond the natural science, beyond the computer models, to actually have a parallel conversation on governance. If you don't have a legitimate basis on which you can weigh those risks or even figure out what you don't know, whatever decision we arrive at, whether unilaterally or multilaterally, is going to have severe, not just natural consequences, but severe human consequences. We are messing up with the planet. We are doing things to the planet. The planet is going to do things to us. But the biggest challenge is we don't know what we'll do to each other.
Thank you very much, Arunabha. So you have both given an initial entry point to the question. Now, we were planning something special to have you participate in this debate a little bit. And so we are asking you to fill a live poll now. You all know about this app here, hashtag K4SD. Normally you should have the app already open. And if you're on the app, then please go on the agenda, find our controversy on climate engineering there. And then at the bottom of the page, you can click on Join Live Poll. And then you'll find 3 questions, and you're asked to answer these questions, and I'm going through these questions in a minute here as well. And then we'll see what you say to it, and then we'll bring that question back also to the podium here and see what our experts think of it. So let me maybe quickly bring up these questions here and explain to you what I mean by this. So considering the consequences for development that you've heard about, should solar radiation modification, in particular this putting aerosols in the stratosphere, be regulated internationally, Or perhaps should it be directly banned because we know too little of the risks and we may be doing something that is just crazy for the moment? Should developing countries, in particular small island states, have the right to just start this business unilaterally? The thing is that, I mean, as we've heard, this can be highly efficient and quick. And if we think of island states here, these may be countries that just sink and that will, or at least lose a lot of surface if we don't act quickly, and it's pretty clear that we're not acting quickly enough for some of them. So, but still, I mean, this risk issue is in the air, so should they just have the right to get it started? It's not so expensive that a group of them could not do it in principle. And the third question is, should further research on this business be encouraged or rather banned? Because if it's really dangerous, it may be something like doing research on atomic bombs, right? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. So, so that's the three things I would be interested in having your opinion on first, and then later on by the two of them. So we'll give you a minute or two to fill this in. And perhaps in between, I can come back with one question to the two of you. You mentioned some of the risks, and you mentioned the governance problems, to which I think we are going to come back at length in some way, because both of you have done a lot of work on this. But I keep wondering also about issues at a different level, maybe psychological. I mean, I wouldn't want to live in a situation where I have this kind of darkness of a volcano cloud around me all the time. Do we know anything at all about this side, and what this may do to people, to not just to plants, but also to living beings? Maybe we start with you, Arunabha, this time.
You know, when I first started working on this, Katya, there's an Australian academic called Clive Hamilton who first started talking about if we seriously consider solar geoengineering, then we should say goodbye to blue skies. Now, that might be something we should be concerned about, but look, I live in New Delhi, where we have very smoggy skies. I just came in from Seoul a few hours ago, which itself has its own, Northeast Asia has its own air quality problem. I think in the scale of concerns that I would have, I would be less concerned about whether I am able to see blue skies or not, or whether I'm enveloped with a dark cloud. I don't think that's exactly how it's envisioned. This is about injecting particles in the stratosphere, and you do it depending on how you're modeling this. You do it in particular seasons, or you do it all year round, or you do it only between the tropics, or you do it spread across the globe. We can model all of this out, but to me, that's not the real issue. The psychological concern for me is, if we think mistakenly, in my opinion, that this is a genuine plan B, then do we stop acting on plan A, which is to mitigate carbon emissions or get the carbon emissions out of the atmosphere? If that's how we start thinking about what is called the moral hazard, that to me is the worst psychological impact that we are likely to have as a species and our impact on the planet.
Mm-hmm. Because at the same time also we'll have to go on and on with this, right? And I mean, we can't...
That's correct. That is called a termination effect, or more simply put, you know, if you were to step on a spring to push it down, and then you step back off, it would jump up. And that's some of the research that certain scientists are doing, whether solar geoengineering will indeed have a termination effect. Look, very simply put, a carbon dioxide molecule is going to stay in the atmosphere for a very long time, several hundred years. Now, if faced with a climate emergency, say in 2030, a bunch of countries decided to do solar geoengineering for 10 years. What happens on the 11th year? That carbon dioxide molecule is still there in the atmosphere. So we are in some ways comparing apples and oranges. So when we think about plan Bs, they can't be equivalent to plan A. Plan B can only be an emergency response. And then we have to ask ourselves, what is the nature of the emergency that we are willing to even consider this kind of a response to, versus if we were not to do that, what kind of emergency situation would we be willing to withstand?
What's the emergency situation we need to make this a plan B that we should look at?
Right. I mean, that is, to me, a central question. I think initially there's a case that says, well, why should we be researching solar geoengineering now? Shouldn't we just be solely focusing on mitigation? The risk there is that there will come a day of, there might come a day of what could be genuinely called a climate emergency. I know that phrase gets thrown around a lot now, but I'm referring to severe, undeniable, widespread impacts of anthropogenic climate change. What then? There will likely be a temptation to use solar geoengineering, which is fairly fast acting. And the question is, would we want to be in that situation with more or less knowledge? So emergency decision making is not out of the question, and we should prepare a knowledge base before to lead up to that. And even more generally, stepping back, what are the risks that worry me? As I look at things, the direct physical and environmental risks of a moderate dose of solar geoengineering look less and less severe as research has gone on. What worries me the most are the social issues, the political issues, for example, around international decision making. We need to start thinking about processes of international negotiation towards decision making. Because what's important about solar geoengineering is it's almost the mirror image of emissions cuts, in the sense that with emissions cuts, we're trying so hard to get everybody to do as much as possible because we're not doing enough. The risk with solar geoengineering is because it appears to be so expensive that someone might do it too early or too much. So it's a question of restraint. And that's a different problem structure. It might be easier to manage, but it's still a serious one.
Okay, let's now get to what you all responded to the questions. Maybe we can put this up on the screen now. So that was the first question. Should solar radiation modification be regulated internationally or even directly banned? So very few people said no international regulation, and the vast majority said it should also not ban, but there is still a quarter. And well, almost 70% say there should be some international regulation we should think of. Now, second question, please. So for the second question, should developing countries, in particular small island states, have the right to just start off with SAI unilaterally? And here, again, almost 3/4 say no. 1/4 says yes, and I guess that reflects in a way what we saw before, that there should be some kind of an international regulation. Now let's get to the third question, please. Okay, so we can see that we are in a group of researchers here mostly. So most of us apparently feel that there should be some research on this, and just 8%, maybe this is the non-researchers in the crowd, I don't know, feel that it should be directly banned. So we have an idea now what the public thinks. I give the word back to you. I don't know in which order now. Shall we start again with you, Arunabha? Some comments on what people said or on the questions themselves, what you think about the questions, what would have been your answer?
Sure, Katya. I'm not surprised by the answers. And therefore, I think it's important then to dig a little bit more into what the question is actually asking. You know, the first question, should solar radiation modification be governed internationally? Now, the bulk, nearly 68%, said yes. We should ask ourselves exactly why we are saying yes. I mean, is it, let me be controversial, is it because you're having this conversation in Europe, which generally tends to be multilateralist, and therefore we are saying let's have international regulation? Because, as I said earlier, there is going to be a high amount of messy geopolitics associated with it. The simple reason why I would push for international governance of geoengineering is this. We are talking about technologies that are being deliberately designed to have an impact at a planetary scale. And therefore, no governance system that is short of a planetary scale is likely to be able to respond to the good, the bad, and the ugly effects of any such technological intervention. So then the question is, should it be directly banned? I would say no, because again, going back to what Jesse was saying a little while earlier, we have to, the really bad climate emergency, or what I would call a perfect storm of shocks, coastal flooding, series of years of droughts, agricultural losses, and so forth, large flows of environmentally displaced migrants, we need to know what our options are. But then this bigger question arises, should developing countries have this right? 8 years ago, in 2011, the IPCC had a first meeting on this. And in my lecture at that meeting, I had at that time suggested that faced with a climate emergency, a small island state might think that it is within its sovereign right to undertake a geoengineering experiment. Now that raises the question, if you use your own territory to do something, whether it's your airspace or your territorial waters or your surface area of land, there is actually very little someone else can do to stop you from doing it. So the bigger governance question is, if a group of deeply impacted developing countries decide to come together, who will actually do the experiment or do the intervention for them, given that they might not all have the scientific resources, etc.? Which raises this bigger concern about who are the actors we're talking about. Are we only governing nation states? Are we governing just a group of scientists? Are we governing private interests? Now find me a political forum that brings all of them together on any subject. Do we have nation states, scientists, universities, and private sector dealing with, say, agriculture issues, or even with climate change, or with water? So we don't have that forum at which this could be discussed. So the issue is not whether they are the right. The issue is if they enacted their own sovereign rights, who would do it? And then if they did it, what forum would we discuss it? At which forum would we attribute consequences of it? And how do we then govern what I would call the ungoverned or the ungovernable? So ultimately, the issue comes back to, since we are a bunch of nerdy researchers here, largely, the issue is, if research has to progress on this, how do we design an international research project that is transparent, that is inclusive, that has clear principles of responsibility and liability, that pools resources across countries and institutions, that allows for open intellectual property on all of these? These are the types of principles of research that we have to apply to create a legitimate international program of research on climate geoengineering or solar geoengineering. Anything short of that will get called into question one way or the other, and the messy geopolitics will begin to dominate any kind of results that the scientists would otherwise might want to put forward. And we will not have an informed conversation. You will either have unilateral moves too soon, or even with lesser impacts potentially, you might actually have the pushback against it or the reactionary results of it might be even more consequential. Suppose China decided to do a solar geoengineering experiment, and then a year later India faced a drought. Now, if we have not been able to attribute it, and then India says, well, now it's in our national interest to intervene against China, or vice versa, or it happens with a smaller country and a larger country, we have no governance mechanism to deal with it. Hence, let's have a regulated international research program.
Thank you. So what is your opinion on the questions? I guess, again, it won't be too controversial, right?
No. There's not, at least not within this forum here on the extended international stage that we have. There's a lot of agreement between us. I mean, sure, in the long run, there should, of course, be some form of international governance or regulation, certainly of solar geoengineering. But beyond that, as Aranaba said, once you start to unpack it, it starts to become a bit tricky. I do think that right now, it's too early to open the floor and say, okay, well, let's form the international decision-making body. We just don't know. It's not an urgent issue. It's something where we should start having conversations about to increase the knowledge base. But I would be worried that the wrong types of structures would be put in place too early, and those structures have a way of ossifying. But such structures do need to be in place before some form of global deployment of solar geoengineering. In the meantime, rolling it back to the shorter term, what do we have? What are we doing right now? What do we need to be doing right now? And of course, as you can see, there's a lot of support for research in a room like this, and that's not surprising. But to second something that Aranaba hinted at, but I want to make more explicit, I think one of the most effective things that can be done right now to prevent future problems is internationally cooperative research programs, actually where researchers exchange countries, particularly from the so-called global south to the global north, developing countries to industrialized countries, not only to transfer knowledge, not only to transfer skills and institutional familiarity, but also to develop trust, to develop international trust around this issue. I can look back to something like, what was it called? The International Geophysical Year, which I think was 1957, where the Soviet Union and America opened up cooperation around geophysics research. And not coincidentally, that led to some of the foundational understanding of climate change. We're also at a point where the scale of geoengineering research is really, really small. To give you an idea, a ballpark figure, an order of magnitude figure, is that the global budget for solar geoengineering is around 1% of global climate change research, right? So a tiny sliver. My sense is that should be relatively greater, and that such investments would have strong leverage, bang for the buck, so to speak. Yet, all this talk about regulation has a certain risk as well, and one way we see that playing out is with research. There have not yet been serious, dedicated outdoor experiments in solar geoengineering. And here I don't even mean testing whether we could cool a region or cool the planet. I just mean, could we get the stuff up there? What would the substances do in the stratosphere? And there's been an outdoor project that's been planned out of Harvard to take a balloon to the stratosphere and inject a few kilograms of sulfur, which is something that comes out of every aircraft as it burns jet fuel, make a little cloud of sulfur aerosols, and then the balloon would loop back around and then take some measurements about the stratospheric chemistry. It would have negligible environmental impact, but it's been at the planning stage for almost 7 years now, in part because of concerns that this idea of the first outdoor experiment is crossing some sort of a threshold, and the debates around it have taken on the form of some sort of proxy debate about, are we ever going to go down this road? And that is an understandable concern, but it also worries me that we seem to have hit a barrier with knowledge acquisition that's getting hung up around decisions that are in the future. I think there's a time to put off having certain conversations, and having the big conversation might be worth tabling for a little bit in this context.
Just a quick word maybe before we open up. I mean, you said we are not in an urgency to now find the right institution, but if it happens, as Arunabha said, maybe China or India starts off with something bigger than maybe just what you, the kind of small experimental things you brought up right now. And then maybe there is some kind of a conflict between different countries because one country feels, well, I need this now, and the other one feels, well, but I need my monsoon.
Yeah.
Then what do we do? You're a legal scholar, so will you solve it then for us?
Oh, I can't solve it, but I can say in the unlikely event that something like that were to happen, that if a country like China were to push so far ahead of where the research is now and undertake an outdoor experiment that could feasibly have an effect on, let's say, India's precipitation patterns, that becomes an international political issue. Much more than one of legal agreements.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Yes,
Katya, okay. I know you want to bring in the audience, but I just wanted to take a minute on the last set of points that Jesse made, if that's all right.
Sure.
So I think, again, this is where we need to be able to distinguish between the scale of a scientific experiment and the scale of its political consequences. You know, a few kilograms of sulfur that the Harvard Scopex experiment is suggesting on paper does not seem like a big deal. The issue here is, if we are genuinely invested in an international research effort towards this, then why is it that the Scientific Advisory Committee for that experiment has no non-American on it, right? Now you could say, well, it doesn't even have to have a non-Harvard person. This is a Harvard experiment, Harvard can decide. But you see, this is where politics and science need to find some midway. And if we decided today that rather than thinking of a top-down regulatory model, ban or no ban, we actually think of an internationally collaborative research effort where Tsinghua University of China is involved and an IIT in India is involved and Harvard or Stanford are involved, then it does not matter actually eventually where the scientist is located because it is an international effort for an international crisis that we as a collective species have created. But when we don't do that, then all sorts of intentions and motivations are attributed, which then makes that whole scientific endeavor harder to undertake, and which is why you had this 7-year interregnum between proposing an experiment, even getting even close to doing it. We all agree that we need more information. Why don't we just, rather than talk about it, actually come together and form that international research consortium?
Thank you. I know you want to answer, but I'll ask you to hold back for a sec so that we can take at least 2 questions or so from the audience and then have a very brief answering back. Yes, please, could the microphone get to the lady here and then the gentleman behind? Oh, there is a third. Can we take 3, Ramona? Short questions, please, so then we'll get 3 people in.
Hi, my name is Carolina. I'm from Peru, but I'm based in Brazil. I'm from SDSN Amazonia, and I wanted to talk about my experience of my previous research in tropical forests and the emissions of aerosols. Fires also are aerosols that will become clouds. So researchers had said that putting our aerosols on the atmosphere will create more clouds, and it would create as well hails. And I think solutions that modify climate are not so good for us. And why not to think about in other climate solutions, like turning carbon dioxide into rocks? That is a solution that is being developed by the French National Center for Scientific Research, or also by the University of Iceland, Columbia University, and it's funded by the EU. And why thinking on a plan B? The current development model will not help us to achieve the 2030 agenda. we need to change our policies and stop fossil fuels as a source of energy. So I think we are not thinking about the primary climate change issues that are contributed to the CO2 emissions.
Thank you very much. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to the conference and, of course, to the two debaters. Very enlightening. Simply an observation. In fact, there has been for at least 10 years a global discussion taking place in one of the important nodes in terms of environmental governance around the world. That's within the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. In fact, and in contrast to the options we were provided in the poll, ban, no ban, there in fact is arguably a de facto moratorium already in place as decided by the parties to the CBD in Mexico in I believe late December in 2016. So there already is a forum. It may be insufficient, it may be weak, it may not be broad enough, but there is a forum in which there has been global dialogue taking place, and not just with the parties to that convention, which, by the way, includes virtually every country, every member state of the UN who have ratified the CBD, with the exception of two parties, the Holy See in Rome and the United States of America. But otherwise, it's highly representative of the interests that, in fact, do need to be surrounded and reflected in the discussion. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we have the last question from this side. It's okay. Thank you, because we're anyway running out of time, so thank you very much. So let's get back to the two of you, and this time maybe Jesse, you start, and Arunava will have the last word then.
Yes, okay. Quickly responding to 2 points that Carolina brought up. One, her main point was, why don't we pursue these other options? And I would strongly emphasize we should be pursuing all options, certainly in terms of a research agenda, simply in terms of a risk management strategy. If one option doesn't pan out, you want to have other tools in your toolkit. And to me, solar geoengineering and carbon removal and turning carbon dioxide into stones and solar panels and nuclear power, these are all different tools in a toolkit, and we need a diverse toolkit. An interesting thing briefly about aerosols is, ironically right now, low-level air pollution cools the planet because there's aerosols in it. When you have these hazy days in Delhi, it keeps Delhi cool, oddly enough. And as we reduce particulate air pollution, we're actually going to accidentally increase warming because we take out these low-level aerosols. So that's an interesting way of thinking about stratospheric aerosol injection from the other direction, looking down on the ground, that we're reducing low-level aerosols and having a warming effect. On the CBD, yes, the parties to the CBD have discussed geoengineering, and they've made 3 different decisions. One was sort of reached in 2010 with something of a statement of caution. I would personally not characterize it as a de facto moratorium, but a warning saying, hey, states, don't do this recklessly, especially if it's something that might affect biodiversity. But also more recently in 2016, the decision said, we need more research in order to understand potential impacts on biodiversity.
Thank you very much. Arunava?
Yeah, I think to the first question, the lady from Peru, I think if I heard correctly, this is exactly why we need to stop using the broader term of geoengineering, and I think this is how at least the research community has progressed, where carbon dioxide removal or carbon capture and storage, these are all very different types of technologies. Carbon capture and storage and direct air capture and afforestation, very, very different technological interventions with very different pros and cons. And that's just in the category of carbon dioxide removal. And then we have solar geoengineering, where you have the more discussed aspect of sulfate aerosols, but in the stratosphere, but there are others as well. So any kind of governance system has to be incisive enough to be able to respond to the specific merits and demerits, which then brings me to the second question. And I referenced this earlier as well. Our objective function cannot simply be the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as much as climate change is perhaps the biggest existential challenge we are faced with currently. We have 9 planetary boundaries that are under stress. On top of that, you still have to grow economies, you have to create jobs, you have to build infrastructure, you have to pay attention to public health, the whole SDG framework. Which is why I also believe that the precautionary principle that the conventional biological diversity that it has taken, while with regards to biodiversity it might be correct, and then the subsequent revision of that decision to say we would like to know more about what's happening in biodiversity is only partially enough as a governance move. Because then you have to think about which body is going to think about impacts on water, which body is going to think about displacement of environmental refugees, which body is going to think about direct impacts of climate change, and which body is going to think about second and third order impacts of climate change. Currently, we have a bunch of, it could be UN Environment, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN CBD. We just had the latest COP on the UN Convention on Desertification in New Delhi just last month, where a New Delhi declaration is brought out about land restoration. Now, is land restoration going to be a carbon dioxide removal technology? Now, all of these different forums do exist, and they will all play some role or the other in this broader conversation. I would simply urge that before we invent a new institution that top-down decides a yes, no, or a moratorium, let's at least aim, as I've been repeatedly saying on this panel, let's aim for a research program. Let's have self-reporting on what that research program, international research program, is going to do. Let's then have peer review, not just amongst academics, but by social scientists, by political leaders, and so forth. Let's have national registries, international registries of what is going on, and then international assessments of that science, just like the IPCC does. All this is a graduated way towards getting to an overall multilateral governance mechanism that would be legitimate. We are not there yet, but we can't say because that ideal condition doesn't exist, we don't do anything.
Thank you very much, Arunabha.
And this is always the dangerous thing.
Thank you very much, Jesse. I think we had a very rich discussion. Thanks so much for this introduction into these issues of climate engineering. I think the two speakers haven't been as controversial as it might have been, but I think they have brought across the controversial issues that exist in this area. And maybe one or the other of you has become more interested now in getting into this and forming part, perhaps at some point, in this international research group that may at some point come up. And well, I can only promote the readings from both of our speakers here that at least helped me to get on the topic. And maybe if I can get back my slide quickly where the questions were, because I have no, it's not coming anymore. I have another very small reading, some promotion of our Swiss Academy's fact sheet. This is on very few pages, like 3-4 pages. You get an idea about what these different technologies are all about. I found it also a very helpful overview for someone who really wants to get onto the topic, so that you can put these different technologies in the right set. Is it negative emissions technology, or is it the solar injection of aerosols, and what does it belong to? How risky is it? There is a whole brief table on all of this. Thanks again to both of you. I think it was really helpful to me too. I learned a lot. And I guess now we move on to the cocktail session with more interesting speeches. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.